anyone understand my wants, I had recourse to my countryman, Professor Morris, who had been thoughtful enough to give me his address the night before. I informed him of my desire, at which he looked grave and asked me what my resources were. I told him that I had enough to answer all my present wants, having about $50,000 in American gold in my safe aboard the vessel, and that I wanted was to find a safe bank where I could deposit it and convert it into money of the country as occasion should require. My dear sir, said the professor seriously, I fear that your greatest disappointment with a country will be when I enlighten you on the subject of your inquiry. Such things as banks are unknown in the financial system of this country. But surely, said I, there are places of exchange where I can convert American gold into the currency of the country. No, he replied, for the simple reason that gold is not money in this country and is convertible into money on the basis of its intrinsic value, as iron, coal, and other commodities are. I understand that, I interrupted, and in that your system is not really different from ours. Gold money with us is based on the intrinsic value of the metal, and therefore differs from silver and other forms of currency. That is the beauty of the gold standard to which the United States is destined, which we don't have anymore, by the way. Reader's note. We don't have a gold standard anymore. It's just backed on faith, and it's backed on debt owed by the government to the private group of banks called the Federal Reserve Banks, which are exactly as federal as McDonald's or the Kitty Cat Porn Ranch in Nevada. So just saying on that. That is the beauty of the gold standard to which the United States is destined. There is no artificial or fiat value inherent in it. Consequently, it is worth as much in any other country as it is in ours. Yes, replied the professor with a smile, it is worth as much in any other country where it is used for money, but you must know, my dear sir, that it is from its use as money that it derives its chief value. In this country, it is never used for money, and its intrinsic value is only what it derives from its utility in other respects, the same as tin, iron, or copper. It is not half so useful as any of these, but it is much scarcer and is relatively higher on that account. Still, you must be terribly disappointed when I tell you that what was a handsome fortune for you in America is comparatively an insignificant sum in the Iron Republic. There will not be the slightest trouble, though, in converting it into money of the realm, and you need have no hesitancy about doing it, as you can reconvert it into gold at the same rate at any time. In other words, you can deposit it in the government exchange, receiving its value in currency with the privilege of exchanging the currency for gold again at any time. Come, said he, let us go down and arrange it at once. Going out, we took a kind of horseless cab and soon alighted before, by far, the largest building I had yet seen. Rather, I should say we were alighted in it, for the streets passed through the building, as did a number of railroads. Going into an office, the professor walked up to the counter and asked the price of gold. The clerk in charge handed out an official sheet that looked like a market report, and with his pencil pointed to the quotation of gold on the list. We learned from this that it was worth 2 diems, pronounced diems, or diems, per pound. A simple calculation showed my $50,000 of American coin to be worth about $666. Another sort of symbol in there. I was dumbfounded. In a single moment I felt a handsome fortune swept from my hands. I actually cowered as from a blow. My companion must have noted it, for he slapped me on the shoulder and rallied me, saying that I was richer in the Iron Republic without a dollar than I would be anywhere else in the world with $1 million. $600? Why, I said despairingly, that is not enough to support me until I can find work. Why, my friend, that is enough to keep you in comfort for several years, and there is your vessel worth 10,000 diams, at least, enough to make you a very rich man indeed in this country. After ascertaining the market value of my gold, it took but a short time to have it brought to the government exchange and weighed in. Before the metal was weighed in, the clerk in charge asked me for my seal. In turn, I looked inquiringly and rather helplessly to Professor Morris, who explained that I was not a citizen and therefore had no seal. This seemed likely to prove a fatal hitch in the proceedings, for the clerk said it was impossible for him to certify me unless I had a seal. After consultation, it was arranged by having Professor Morris deposit it for me. It may be supposed that I was an interested observer of these conventionalities, so entirely new and strange to me. Drawing what appeared to be a disc of hard rubber about the size of a 25-cent piece from his purse, my friend dropped it into the slot of a registering device attached to the scales. The clerk in charge pressed a lever, and a small card fell out along with the professor's seal. Placing the seal in his pocket, Professor Morris handed me the card. On one side was a facsimile of the seal, a circular ornamented border, and within the words, W.A. Morris, American citizen by grace 1863. On the reverse was stamped in figures that cut into the card the exact weight of the metal. The entire business was transacted without the agent of the government ever touching the gold or the receipt for it. From the scales, the metal was passed to the assayer nearby, who put a stamp under the weight, indicating its fineness, and then it was tagged and carried to a vault-like storeroom. Passing to another department, for the place was arranged similar to a great bank, the professor laid down his card and had counted out to him a pile of bills, something like bank checks, ruled crossways on the back to hold many signatures, aggregating 654 diams, the alloy and the gold making it worth 12 diams less than the quoted price. These bills were handed over to me, and the business was completed. Now, I think it's odd that he received, instead of 666 diams, 654, which is 12 less than 666. So, kind of odd numerology here. I guess we'll just take that at face value and assume that it's a coincidence. Anyway, off of that reader's note, but it was 12 diams less than the quoted price. These bills were handed over to me, and the business was completed. The whole transaction consumed scarcely more time than it takes to describe it, and we went from there to the Marine Office, where we met the President, and the three of us launched with the Director of Navigation at a hotel. At 2 o'clock we repaired to the station to take the cars for the capital of the Republic. The President and Professor Morris were recognized and greeted courteously by almost everyone we met. But there was no groveling or sycophancy. I could scarcely realize that I was in the company of the President of a great nation, so simple and unpretentious were his manners and carriage. He carried his own carpet-bag in his hand and seemed to expect no more deference than anybody else. Professor Morris purchased my ticket for me, and we sat down with a number of others in a comfortable waiting room, and in a few minutes a porter came in and announced that the Capital City Express was waiting. We went through a gate where our tickets were taken up and passed into the cars. These cars were 4 feet wide, 6 feet high, and 24 feet long. The seats extended entirely across the car, and there was no provision made for walking about in the coach. Between every two seats placed to face each other, a door opened up from the side so that they were practically compartment cars with room in each compartment for 4 persons. There were a dozen or 15 of these cars in the train, but no locomotive, engineer, or conductor was in sight. I noticed that the end of the car at the front of the train was pointed like the bow of a boat, and when the passengers were ushered into the cars, the doors were all unlocked from the outside. A full description of these railroads with detailed drawings and specifications of their entire equipment is furnished with my official report, but will not be injected into this narrative as it would doubtless be tedious to the lay reader. In order, though, that my reader may better understand the plan of the cars I have been describing, I will state that this railroad was an elevated affair, massive iron pillars set in the ground like those on which are laid the elevated railroads of New York. There was no heavy superstructure, though, as in American elevated railways. The tracks are girdles on which the cars run, being placed one at the top and the other about 6 feet lower down, thus making one track directly above the other instead of being side by side, as on American railways. The cars were elevated on an average about 10 feet from the ground. On account of depressions, they sometimes ran considerably higher, but never less than 10 feet over a road or lower than 6 feet anywhere. Thus, they could encounter no obstacles and were so attached to the track that they could not fly off even if the wheels on which they ran were broken or detached. The railway was double-tracked, that is, there were 2 sets of tracks, one on either side, of the upright iron pillars, and the cars on opposite sides ran in opposite directions, so they could never collide. The columns which supported this novel railway were set about the same distance apart as those of an American elevated railroad, and as they took up scarcely any room, and required no right-of-way, the road ran through farms and villages without danger or inconvenience to anybody. The freight cars, which I saw a great many standing in the government storehouse or exchange, were simply iron cylinders of about the same size as the passenger cars. The passenger trains were run in the daytime and the freight trains at night. This description applies to all of the railroads in the Republic except some roads which were built for carrying coal, ores, etc. These run underground. These roads are run entirely different from American railways, trains never stopping at stations to put off or take on passengers. After it leaves the starting point, a car never stops till it reaches its destination, where it is switched down from the main line and rests on a track underneath it and on a level with the floor of the station. For instance, the train we took at Corinthus never slackened speed a particle from the time it got underway until it ran down on its siding at Ionia, some 700 miles distant. No car ever stops on the main line, and by a very ingenious arrangement, cars on the main line can never get within less than 10 miles of each other. The motive power is electricity, and when they get closer together than 10 miles, the current is cut off from the rear train so that it loses speed. I have, as I have said, a full technical description of this railway system furnished me by the government engineer, for it goes without saying that this is owned and managed entirely by the government. In a few moments after the bustling porter ushered us into the compartment, we started off with a gentle motion which increased until within less than 2 minutes. We were flying across the country with a velocity I never conceived before. There was no noise, no jar, the motion being more like that of a flying ice boat or smooth toboggan slide than anything else. The President and Professor Morris endeavored to draw me into conversation, but a faintness and dizziness came over me so prostrating that I seemed on the verge of collapse. I struggled against it and brought to bear all the force of will I possessed, but the fearful speed completely unnerved me. The cars being elevated above the ground and the windows but a little below the level of the eye, we could see only the landscape at some distance, and as it flew by, I felt as if I were imprisoned in a great cannonball being fired through space. Cold perspiration broke out on me, and try as I might, it was impossible for me to conceal my distress. It was not fear, for I knew from the construction of the cars and road that an accident was reasonably impossible, and I was assured by my companions that a fatal accident had never occurred on the road. It was only the smooth, noiseless, terrible speed that affected me, and within an hour it wore off, and I was myself again to begin to take a lively interest in the country through which we were passing. As we sped on through the great tracts of country covered with farms, towns, and villages, over great rivers, across hills and valleys, it made a flying panorama, beautiful beyond description. Frequently we intersected other roads like ours with flying cars crossing either above or below them. It was not long after I had recovered sufficiently to become interested in the outside world before I observed what, strangely enough, I had not noticed before. That was people flying about the country with the greatest ease and grace. I had not noticed any suggestion of aerial navigation at Corinthus, but Professor Morris told me that if I had been in the suburbs, I would have seen hundreds of people out every fine afternoon flying for pleasure. I was not surprised to see the air navigated, for I had long been of the opinion that it was only a matter of time when the feat would be accomplished in America. I was surprised, though, at the simplicity of the flying machines. I had been accustomed to think of practical flying machines as something very complicated and large, a kind of balloon, car, and steamboat combined. But here were people flying about with the greatest of ease, with nothing but a sail drawn over a frame like a great bird's wings, underneath which they swang like a spider under its web. A propelling wheel of the same materials was driven sometimes by light machinery, but most often by the muscles of the flyers. Narrator's note, it sounds to me like he's describing essentially a hang glider with some sort of propulsion on it, and by the way, we have similar technologies here today that are fairly recent, I believe, since the 90s or maybe early 2000s, where you've got these inventors that get up on, I believe, either hang gliders or some sort of a hot air balloon or something to that effect, but they put these big buoy bayou boat motors, like those big airboat motors on it, and they just haul behind through the air on either, I guess it's either hang gliders and or some sort of a buoyant balloon apparatus. But anyway, so he believed that sometimes by light machinery, but most often by the muscles of the flyers, these things were being propelled. So I'm not sure how he would have discerned that, but anyways, it all seemed so easily and gracefully done that I could not help wondering that people were not flying the world over. How is it, I asked my companions, that people here seem to do so easily what we've labored vainly so many years in my country to accomplish? Are you stronger, or is the atmosphere more dense? Neither nor one nor the other, answered Professor Morris. You people have always gone at it the wrong way, or had, up to the time I left the country. You've been swallowed up with the idea of machinery. You have seen birds carry their own weight, and twice as much besides, with ease. You've seen clumsy squirrels expand their skins by stretching out their legs and make astonishing flights through the air. And yet, though knowing that man is one of the strongest animals in the world to his size, it has not yet occurred to you to apply that strength intelligently in the effort to fly. Really, your attempts at flying have been quite ridiculous, as it would be to attempt to swim by machinery. With a light aeroplane having the requisite area surface and simple gear with which he could apply the strength of his back, arms, and legs to a propelling fan, your boys with the opportunity would learn to fly quite as easily as they learned to swim. All you require to enable young America to acquire expertness in the air, as he does in the water and on the ice, is the simple aeroplane and high wire 200 or 300 feet in length from which he could suspend himself while learning to manipulate his flyer. A moment's reflection convinced me that the professor was right, and during the entire trip nothing interested me so much as to watch the graceful flyers, whom were nearly always some in view. I inquired if there were not a very great many casualties resulting from such hazardous exercises, and was informed that there were none at all, that if anything should happen to the aeronaut in mid-air, the aeroplane would let him down to earth as gently as a parachute and without danger. Seeing how absorbed I was with the outside view and appreciating my curiosity, my companions very considerately left me to myself for the most part of the journey, while they discussed matters of interest to the country at large. We arrived at the capital at 6 o'clock, making the 700 miles in 4 hours and 25 minutes. When we reached our destination and the train stopped, the doors were open for the first time since we started, and descending, we found ourselves in a large vaulted room surrounded by all the bustle incident to a great and prosperous city. Professor Morris called a carriage, and parting from President Wilkes, who cordially invited me to call on him at the executive department, we took our seats and were driven, or propelled rather, through the wide tree-bordered streets to the professor's home in the suburbs. Being but a dull, practical clod, language fails me to describe the feelings and impressions of that hour. The streets were brilliantly lighted and were filled with gaily dressed people, some walking, some riding in carriages or on bicycles, some standing in knots about the corners or sitting on rustic iron seats under the trees along the curb. And notwithstanding the great concourse, there was no noise except the laughter and conversation of the people. As in Corinthus, there was not a horse to be seen, all of the conveyances being self-propelling. The light and the glamour, the beautiful costumes, the noiseless, swiftly moving carriages all seemed like a dream of a fairyland. In the delightful home of my countryman and patron, there was not so much to remind me that I was in a strange country. The decorations and furnishings were not so different from that of the best houses in America, except that besides real works of art, there seemed to be a strict adherence to the rule that everything that was there for use. There was no piling up of heterogeneous and conglomerate masses of trumpery, such as to be found in many so-called fashionable houses of America under the general term of bric-a-brac. The general style of furnishing was something between American luxurious and Japanese simplicity and utility. The room into which I was ushered seemed to be a parlor, library, and general receiving room all in one, and was warmed by an electricity, but that cheerful glow which the sight of a ruddy fire imparts was obtained by having an open grate piled with unconsumable logs that blazed white and red when the current was turned on. A handsome instrument reaching almost to the ceiling, and which I afterwards found to be a combination of pipe organ and grand piano, stood in one corner, and by it a music rack piled with what appeared to be a great variety of music. After conducting me into this room and requesting me to make myself at home, my host stepped to the mantel over which was a transmitter, something like that which I had seen in the office at the Director of Navigation at Corinthus, and pulled out a stop, whereupon the tones, sweet and rich, but soft and low, the most beautiful orchestral music seemed to float and fill the room. He then excused himself and withdrew, saying that he would rejoin me directly. I was so charmed with the music that sounded like the far-off strains of some grand orchestra that I made no note of time and was only recalled to my surroundings when Professor Morris advanced into the room leading a handsome woman of middle age, who he introduced to me as his wife. Extending her hand, she greeted me most cordially, while the professor shut off the music, welcoming me to their country and particularly to her home. I acknowledged her courtesy in the best language I was able to command, and expressed my sincere and heartfelt gratitude for the warm welcome I had received from everyone I had met, especially from herself and generous husband. My hostess was dressed in a house gown or kind of wrapper, and was certainly a very prepossessing woman. With a most engaging smile, she assured me that in meeting a countryman of her husband's, she felt that she was meeting a near relative, and with a directness and simplicity that completely captivated me, she expressed the hope that I would reciprocate the feeling. She also insisted, and in this she was joined by her husband, that I should make their house my home all the time, and any time that I was in the capital. As I had but little time to talk with my host before, the conversation naturally turned to the world we had left, and especially to our native country. I briefly outlined the course of events from the time he left the United States down to the present. In all this, as may be supposed, he was deeply interested, and his charming wife appeared to be not less so. The Civil War was in progress when he left America, and it was with great satisfaction that he learned the Union had preserved and loyal friendship again established between the states. And I have a bit of contention with that remark as well. That's just me personally. I tend to think that the not-so-good guys won the Civil War, but that's just me. Hey, the winners always write the history books, so of course the good guys always win the wars, but I digress. So anyway, he informed me that he was a young officer in the Navy when the war broke out, but being of Southern birth, he could not take up arms against his native state, and at the same time he was too loyal to array himself against the federal government. As a way out of it, he resigned, and being quite wealthy, he purchased and manned a vessel, and having long cherished a desire for polar exploration, resolved to spend the period during which the war was being waged in a voyage to the Antarctic regions. Like myself, he had found the passage through the ice barriers and sailed down to the coast of the Iron Republic. As he was familiar with the history of the world, and particularly that of the United States down to 1861 when he had left, and as the wonderful country in which I found myself was as new to me as if it had been located on Jupiter or Mars, there was of course far more for me to learn than to tell, but as I knew how great his interest must be in the world he had left more than 30 years before, and had never heard from since, I forbore asking any questions concerning his adopted country until I had imparted to him as thorough a knowledge as possible of what had taken place in the old world since he had left it. As I warmed up in this endeavor, inspired by the eager interest of both my host and his wife, who listened with rapt attention, I was interrupted